welcome everyone to the third day of the first ever University of Windsor Palestinian Human Rights Group. Before I begin, I'd like to just give the brief story of how we got Dr. Finkelstein to come, because I think it says a lot about him. Originally, we thought we would never be able to get somebody like Dr. Finkelstein to come here, especially because we were such a new group. We had such low resources, and we thought we'd have to settle for just a really, really simple week with no really giant international speakers like him. So, in an attempt to try to reach him, I connected with an organization called Canadians for Peace and Justice in the Middle East, and I knew they organized speakers on this issue, so I contacted their president, and he told me that he knew Finkelstein and he could help get him to come. So this was months ago, and there was about at least 2 months of back and forth emails and confusion and miscommunication, and at the end, about let's say 2 or 3 weeks ago, we realized that they weren't going to get him to us, and the president said, "I'm sorry, we can't get him to you." The whole ordeal was in vain. And then we were planning to figure out what we can do to replace him, what we can do to fill in his spot, because we already planned the schedule. And I decided, let's just try emailing him directly once and see what happens. And so I emailed him I don't know exactly when, it was 3 weeks ago. So this is really short notice, especially for a big speaker like him. I emailed him, and the next day I got a response saying, "Okay, I'll come." And this was, beyond anything we ever thought could happen. But nevertheless, he's here now. I'm just going to give a brief overview of our group, and then Dr. Cook will introduce Dr. Finkelstein. Basically, this group is almost a year old. I started it, by the way, my name is Mohammed Al-Muayyad. I'm the president of the Palestinian Solidarity Group. I founded the group in June, and at first it was really difficult to get members, except I knew there was potential for it to grow. Then in the fall, we started forming an executive team. We started planning what we wanted to do, and now we have much more members. We're going to become a very, very active club after this week is done. We have a list of registered students that goes over, I think, 300 right now. So we rapidly expanded in the last month. And basically, to give a sort of, I mentioned this the first day of the week, but I think it's a good story to explain why this group started. Last year, a very prominent Israeli diplomat from Toronto came to give a talk. I think it was here too. And I came to the talk, and I overheard I think he had some sort of entourage or some group of people with him, like Secret Service people, and they were discussing stuff with some people from the university administration, and they said they were talking about how wonderful this campus is because we didn't have anything like Israeli Apartheid Week. We didn't have any Palestinian groups. We didn't have anything like that. This is a very wonderful, nice campus. And then at that point, I decided next year we have to do something for sure. So, and that was the genesis of the group. Okay, now Dr. Cook, who is a philosophy professor here and a member of Faculty for Palestine, is going to give a brief introduction to Dr. Finkelstein.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thanks to the Palestinian Solidarity Group for putting this amazing event on. Welcome to Palestinian Human Rights Week. And welcome also to Dr. Norman Finkelstein, who will be giving the talk this evening. My name is Professor Cook, and I will be chairing the session, as well as acting as marshal. Now, before I introduce our guest, Dr. Finkelstein, I should tell you that there are a few ground rules to make this event run smoothly so that everybody can benefit from hearing our guest and engage productively in the question and answer period. First, the organizers of this event are committed to freedom of speech and open dialogue. We are opposed to Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and all other forms of racism and discrimination. All participation in this event must be in line with these basic commitments. We do not expect any disruptions, but we are working with the university to ensure that any unwelcome disruptions will be dealt with swiftly and immediately so that the event can go on as planned. A disruption would consist in heckling, in making excessive noise, in aggressive actions, either outside or inside this auditorium, and in refusing to respect the chair. We also ask, please, if you want to take photographs, do so, but please do not use a flash, right? In the event that there are disruptions, we will be employing a 3 strikes rule. There are 2 of us, Dr. Noonan over there, and myself, who are acting as marshals. A disruptive person will be given 2 warnings and then asked to leave. If there is a disruption, we ask that you wait patiently while we're dealing with the disruption. And the main goal is to ensure that this event will continue as planned so that everybody can enjoy it. And we will be working quickly to ensure that this can happen. That being said, we welcome everyone to this event, which is, as Mohammed has said, the first Palestinian Human Rights Week at the University of Windsor. We also want to thank those groups and organizations that endorsed this event: the Windsor Workers' Action Center, the Windsor Islamic Association, Women in Solidarity with Palestine, Faculty for Palestine, the Center for Studies in Social Justice, the International Anti-Zionist Jewish Network, the Canadian International Council of Windsor, the Ontario Public Interest Research Group, the Palestinian Canadian Family Association, and the Al-Hijara Mosque. We are honored, we are very honored this evening to have as our guest a world-renowned speaker, Dr. Norman Finkelstein, graduating with a PhD from the Political Studies Department at Princeton University. Dr. Finkelstein has written extensively on the Palestinian situation, as most of you know. I note with interest that he's been remarkably prolific recently, publishing a number of books in a very short span of time. This year, for example, 2 of his books will appear. One of them is called Knowing Too Much, Why the American Jewish Romance with Israel is Coming to an End. The second book to appear this year is What Gandhi Says About Nonviolence, Resistance, and Courage. Last year saw the publication of his book Goldstone Recants. Richard Goldstone renews Israel's Right to Kill. And in 2010, Dr. Finkelstein published This Time We Went Too Far: Truth and Consequences of the Gaza Invasion. Without further ado, then, I would like you to welcome Dr. Finkelstein to our campus.
Well, thank you for having me. Let's just go through the sound check. The people in the last row, if you hear me fine, just raise your hand. Okay, that's not a good beginning. Okay. Is there somebody who can tune up the volume? Is there a sound person in the room?
Bring the mic closer.
That I don't think is going to help. No, sir.
Check.
The people in the last row, if you can hear me fine, raise your hand. That's not good. Okay. There's nobody in charge of sound? Okay. It always takes a little time. Just give us a couple of minutes, we'll figure it out. One possibility is to just change the microphones. Okay. You want to just do a test and see whether that works better in the back?
They can put both microphones in front.
That could be be a problem because of feedback. There's two microphones. Okay, let's just, one moment, we'll figure it out. No.
Destin?
Okay, that seems better than mine. So just switch, let's see. I think that's better. Okay. Sometimes it's the angle. In the back, do you hear me better or worse? We're going to just try one other possibility. Just I'm just going to test if I step, yeah, it's better. Okay. The only thing is I need now just a place for my notes. Okay, can you hear me better now? Yes, I can see. So, okay, that should be fine. Just let me see that I can read my notes as I'm speaking. Okay. I know from past experience, sometimes it takes 20 minutes to get this right, so we're doing fine. Well, thank you for having me here. I'm not quite sure where I am, except I know I'm near Detroit. Which is important in order to get home. And I had a chance to meet with the young people in the group this afternoon over dinner, and I was glad to see it was a nice cross-section of the Middle East, but also somebody from Guyana. And I do hope the next time I come, I'll also see not only non-Arabic and non-Muslim faces in the group, but based on what I'll be speaking about this evening, I hope there are going to be a large contingent of Jewish members of the group, which I think is a realistic possibility if we do things right. We can win a broad spectrum of people, a broad representation of the public over to this issue, and that should include, as I said, a large representation of the Jewish members of this campus as well. I listened closely to the three-strike rule. I like your version. If I can express a preference, I like your version better than the Israeli version, which is 2 warnings, and then we nuke you. 2 warnings, and then we have to be excused from the room. It seems a little bit more civilized. Well, the topic I'm going to be speaking on this evening differs rather significantly from what I've been talking about over a fairly long period of time. I first got involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Hard for me to believe, but it's true. I first got involved about 3 decades ago, this coming 5 June 1982. I first got involved when Israel invaded Lebanon in June 6 June 1982. Israel invaded Lebanon. I wasn't involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict in any significant way, either intellectually or politically, until then. And then I got involved, and certainly I didn't anticipate it. I I couldn't have predicted it, but it ended up consuming the next 3 decades of my life. And in fact, the truth be told, it ended up consuming my entire adulthood. And that's a very sobering fact, as many of you will discover when you're approaching 60 years of age and you start looking back on your life. And when I look back, all I see is, for 30 years, all I really see is Palestine. And most of those 30 years, I've had a pretty conventional modus operandi. What does modus operandi mean? Anyone want to call it out? Yeah, method of operation or mode of operation. It was pretty simple. What I would do is I would on one side show what the documentary record, what the historical record, what the human rights record said about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and then I would juxtapose it. That just means place side by side. I would juxtapose it with the way the record is depicted in the media and in the public arena. And it was very easy to demonstrate. You might even say it was child's play to demonstrate that this huge gap, this chasm, this abyss, separated the record of the conflict as it's been reported in reputable organizations and reputable commentary, as against the way we're told this conflict has unfolded in the media and in the public forum. Well, this past year I decided I was going to do something new, which is I was going to talk not about what happened, and not even about what is happening. For example, the past couple of years I focused pretty precisely on what happened in Gaza during the 2008-2009 Israeli invasion. But this time around, I decided the time was now to, so to speak, get down to business and to discuss how to solve the conflict. A conflict that just goes on and on and on and on, to a point which is almost completely insane. I'm sure that if humanity survives in the next 100 years, that is to say, if a Republican isn't elected president of the United States, if humanity survives, not that Obama's any great shakes, but he hasn't completely lost his marbles. If humanity survives, people are going to look back with complete perplexity at how it came to pass that this tiny pinprick on the world's map, how it came to pass that people couldn't resolve this conflict. It really doesn't make sense. If you take a whole historic epoch, when the history books tell the story of this epoch, of this modern era, there will be one epoch of that era. It will be the epoch of the communist system. And the communist system began roughly, you could say, in November 1917, what's called the October Revolution, and it ended in 1989 with the implosion or the dissolution of the Soviet Union. A whole epoch. Now, the Israel-Palestine conflict, one way to date it is with the Balfour Declaration, which was also issued in November 1917. This conflict has gone on longer than the epoch of communism. from beginning to end. It just doesn't make sense. And I thought that basically for two reasons, it's now important to focus on how to solve the conflict. The first reason is, I don't think it requires any longer a person like myself to come before an audience and tell them that Israel is guilty of many human rights violations and many human rights crimes in that part of the world. Most people know that already. They may not know the details, that's true, and details are important sometimes. But the general picture right now, it doesn't require somebody like myself to itemize Israel's crimes. In fact, as I've said in a number of occasions, it's much more difficult nowadays on a North American college campus. It's much more difficult to make the case for Israel than it is to make the case for the Palestinians. The truth be told, very few people nowadays are willing to come forward before an audience of this size and make the case for Israel. They are not. Those who make the case for Israel, the audience consists mostly of true believers who could fill maybe 2 rows in this room. But that's about it. So I don't think the role that I have performed over the past 30 years is any longer necessary. I think there's a broad public, to which I'll refer again in a moment, that already knows enough to know that the way Israel is carrying on in that part of the world is simply unacceptable, and in many cases, it's criminal. And the second reason I decided we have to focus on a solution rather than to talk about what's going on is I do believe there is a problem that because the conflict has gone on so long, that people have stopped thinking about actually solving it and ending it. That there's this kind of entrenchment in the perpetuation of the conflict, and there's not enough of a mindset that we're not just here to bear witness, we're not just here to shout our indignation and anger, but we want to end it. That one morning we want to wake up and to discover that the Israel-Palestine conflict has been removed from the pages of current events and has finally found its place where it belongs, in the history books. And I want to try this evening to focus on exactly that, namely, what is realistically possible in terms of trying to end the conflict. Now, in my opinion, for reasons which I'm going to go into presently, I do think for the first time in memory, and maybe the first time ever, there is a realistic prospect for ending the conflict. It is possible. And a part of my remarks this evening is going to be to try to make that case. Why things, in my opinion, have changed such that we no longer need merely to be, as it were, howling like lonely wolves in the wilderness, but we can actually win a broad public to end the conflict. And secondly, the second part of what I'm going to be speaking on is what are the terms for ending the conflict? How do you end it? On what basis? What principles? What is the platform? Not only what is the platform, but to my thinking, a much more important preliminary question: how do you formulate a platform? Is it based on what I believe, what he believes, what he believes? Is it based on my morality, his morality, or his morality, or her morality? What is the basis for constructing a solution to the conflict? And that's what I'll be looking at in the second half of my remarks. So, let me begin. Some people think ending the conflict now, that's just wishful thinking. What's the basis for that sort of optimism? I would say there are several rational grounds for some optimism on resolving the conflict. Number one, as everybody in this room knows, there's the phenomenon of the Arab Spring and changes in the Arab-Muslim world generally. First and foremost, Israel lost, not completely, but still significantly, Israel has lost its two critical allies in the Muslim Arab world. The first significant change was, if we can use the term, maybe defection is not correct. Let's just say that under Prime Minister Erdogan, Turkey has carved out a new path for itself, Turkey having been, by a wide margin, Israel's most sturdy and consistent ally in the Muslim world. And Turkey, under Prime Minister Erdogan, has carved out an independent path for Turkey, one which no longer sees Israel as a major ally. Now, it's true when it comes to Mr. Erdogan, there's often a large amount of bluster, and at the end of the day, a relatively small amount of bite. He promises a lot more than he actually does, but he is a politician for sure, and he recognizes that the Palestine conflict has great resonance in the Arab-Muslim world, and consequently has chosen to champion the cause of the Palestinians, most recently the people of Gaza. How far he will take it, it's hard to say. Certainly now he has other preoccupations, most critically Syria, but it's also true to say for sure that he's no longer, or Turkey is no longer, a reliable Israeli ally. The second major defection, if we want to use that word, from the Israeli camp was, of course, the changes that occurred in Egypt. Egypt having been Israel's principal ally in the Arab world since 1979, with the signing of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. And there, too, it's hard to predict just how independent a stance the new Egypt will take, but one thing which is pretty certain is that to the extent that a new government in Egypt is responsive to popular opinion, that new government will be much more hostile to Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people. Now, it is true, and every statement unfortunately has to have a qualification, it is true that the Arab Spring is far from over, and that there have been a lot of developments which at the end of the day may actually end up strengthening the American-Israeli hand rather than weakening it. Most significantly, the developments in Syria may turn out to be a significant setback for the Palestinians if things continue as they do now. If one looks at the picture, broadly speaking, internationally, there's no question that Israel's stock has fallen precipitously over the last 10 years or so. Every year, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, it does a poll. And the poll is usually of about 30, 35 countries. And every year they ask the same question. They list these countries and they ask a sampling in each country. Do you think this country has had a mostly positive impact on world affairs or a mostly negative impact on world affairs? And every year, at the very bottom of the list, there's a cluster of 4 countries which, according to respondents to the BBC poll, these 4 countries are always clustered as having an overwhelmingly negative impact on the world. 3 of the 4 countries will come as no surprise to anyone in this room. North Korea, negative. Pakistan, negative. Iran, negative. But always with those 3 is clustered Israel. Sometimes it has the worst rating in the world. Other years it comes in lower than North Korea, hard as that is to believe. And there are 2 interesting conclusions. One, that Israel should even be included in the category of Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan. But there's a second conclusion which strikes me as even more illuminating, which is the other 3 countries. I doubt anybody here has read anything positive about them in their entire lifetimes. So if I were to make the broad generalization, and I would say, I would bet there is not one person in this room who has ever, and I don't care how old you are, who has ever read a favorable article about North Korea, I would not feel fear of being contradicted. It's just not very common. The last favorable article in North Korea, I think, was January 6, 1932, or something like that. It doesn't happen. And with all due respect to Pakistanis in the audience who always feel a little bit uncomfortable about the category in which they find themselves, it's very rare or never that you read a favorable article about Pakistan in the newspapers. And we can just leave aside Iran. There's no point in arguing with that. But the strange thing is, especially in the North American media and parts of the European press and also places like Australia, the media is overwhelmingly favorable to Israel. And yet, the public has managed to see through the misinformation, the disinformation, the prevarication, the lies, see through all of the mainstream spin and still groups Israel with places like Pakistan and North Korea. It's a very striking fact to give some indication of how public opinion has changed, that when the Palestinian leadership recently put forth the bid for Palestinian statehood at the United Nations, the BBC did a poll, and in every single country polled, every single one, either a plurality or a majority of those polled supported Palestinian statehood. There was not a single exception. When I say not a single exception, I hasten to add that includes the United States. 2 polls were taken of Americans, and in each of the polls, about half of Americans supported Palestinian statehood, and about 1/4 to 1/3 opposed it. Now that is, speaking here as an American, it's a bewildering fact, because you have to remember, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the President of the United States, Mr. Obama, came out forcefully against the Palestinian bid for statehood. Both major political parties, the Republican and Democratic Party, they both issued strong statements against the Palestinian bid for statehood. Both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, came out strongly against it. All the major media, the Washington Post, the New York Times, ran editorials opposing it. But notwithstanding this united, uniform opposition by our ruling elites and their mouthpieces in the media to Palestinian statehood, the broad public said, no, we don't agree. The Palestinian people have a right to a state. It again indicates the extent to which people now, not everyone, but a large section, probably a majority or more of the public, is now open and ready to hearing out the other side. They not only know that something is going awry in that part of the world, something is wrong in Israel-Palestine, but they're ready to hear that Israel bears a significant burden of responsibility for what's going wrong. The poll results regarding the United States, they indicate not only a shift in broad American opinion, but there's also been a big shift, not as acute, but still a big shift in American Jewish public opinion. And the reason is not hard to find. Most American Jews, they're liberal. 80% of American Jews, they vote for Barack Obama for president. That was a higher percentage than any other ethnic group in the United States except African Americans. In fact, if you take Latinos, about 63% of Latinos voted for Barack Obama. Jews, it was 80%. And then when you factor in income, Jews are by far and away now the wealthiest religious ethnic group in the United States. So if most people vote by their pocketbooks, Jews should be voting Republican, the rich person's party. But in fact, they don't. They vote Democratic. In fact, a much larger percentage of Latinos, who are among the poorest ethnic groups in the United States, a much larger percentage of Latinos vote Republican than Jews do. And being liberal in the American, as in the Canadian context, being liberal basically means you believe in the rule of law, you believe in equality under the law, you believe in international organizations like the United Nations, you believe in the peaceful resolution of conflicts, the use of diplomacy. And it's become more and more difficult, if not impossible, for American Jews to reconcile, to square their liberal convictions, their liberal beliefs, their liberal tenets with the way Israel carries on. It's now become a nearly impossible task because basically American Jews, they now know too much. There was a time in the past where knowledge about the conflict was very much controlled by what Israel and its supporters said. And so because they controlled the image of the conflict, it was possible to reconcile for American Jews their liberal beliefs with the way Israel carries on. But Israel no longer controls the message. And it no longer is able to control the image of what goes on there, at least not the way it used to. And now American Jews, they simply can't reconcile what they know or what they can't any longer deny, because the sources of information are so unimpeachable. Many of those sources are either Israeli or organizations which have significant Jewish components, like Human Rights Watch. They can't any longer give blind support to the way Israel carries on. The Jews who grew up in the 1960s, what are called the baby boomers, and they're now in their mid-60s, some of them just hitting or just over 70 years old. When they were growing up in the 60s, the sentiment that captured the era, there are some people in the room from that era, they may actually be expatriates from the United States, because a lot of draft evaders ended up in this part of Canada. But they will remember for sure that the slogan or the spirit was this phrase, I think it was conjured up by John Lennon. It was, "All we are saying is give peace a chance." Who knows that? Raise your hand. That's all. Raise your hand up high if you know that. Okay, so for the rest of the room, we're going to just try 2 rounds to try to create that spirit. All we are saying is give peace a chance. Now for round 2, you have to start swaying. Okay. You get the idea. You were in the US, right? You. No? This fellow here who's wearing the black, right behind you. American?
No.
Oh. I had a feeling, okay. Even prophets can be wrong. So, you grow up, all we are saying is give peace a chance, and that's part of your nostalgia, the residue of your youth. And then you have a government which all it's saying is give war a chance, and give war another chance, and give war another chance. It's very hard if you're Jewish to reconcile the sentiments on which you grew up and which are part of your being with the way this country carries on. It cheerleads the war against Iraq in 2003. Credible estimates, 1 million people killed. 2006, you go into Lebanon, you kill 1,200 people, 1,000 of them civilians. You obliterate the infrastructure of the country. The Lebanese who were just rebuilding after a devastating civil war, and then you go in with your planes and you blow up all the bridges, destroy all the infrastructure. Before the bodies have turned cold and the dust has settled from the rubble, you go into Gaza, you kill 1,400 people, up to 1,200 civilians, 350 children, leave behind 600,000 tons of rubble. Before the bodies have turned cold, before the dust has settled, now you want a war with Iran. You want a war with Iran. Not enough wars. Iraq is not enough. Lebanon is not enough. Gaza is not enough. Now you want another war? Another war? Some of you know that Chris Rock. Who knows Chris Rock? Raise your hand. He used to be funny before he sold out. He was quite funny. And he has a routine. Some of you might have seen it. You know the Michael Jackson routine? Who knows it? Good, two people. And I watched it a couple of times on YouTube. It's very funny. He starts off by saying, "Another kid! Another kid!" Everybody understand the reference? I don't want to have to spell it out because there's some children in this room. And when I look at Israel, I can't help but think, another war? Another war? Another war? You see this pit bull at APEC. I don't watch TV. When I grew up, there was a button, war is unhealthy to human beings and other living things. That's how I feel about television. So I haven't watched TV since 1972, but sometimes when I'm in the airport, I watch it. Yesterday I was in the airport and I saw that pit bull. He's the prime minister of some country. And he was speaking at APEC. I don't get these people. I found myself shouting at the monitor. I did. I was afraid they weren't going to let me on the plane. Because somebody was going to go over to security, watch that guy, he's crazy. It is lunacy. How many wars? How many wars? And if you're American and you're Jewish and you're liberal, it's just really hard to take. That's just not the sentiments in which you were raised and the beliefs to which you claim allegiance. And it's in particular very difficult for young American Jews, college-age Jews, like most of the people in this room. You don't want to have to defend that. Most college-age Jews, they're young, they're liberal, they're idealistic. That's what being Jewish means in North America. Liberal, idealistic. It's 2006. You're in an audience this size. And maybe some of you in the audience fit my profile or description. The last 72 hours of the attack on Lebanon, the war was over. The UN finally passed the ceasefire resolution, that witch from hell, Condoleezza Rice, stopped blocking it. It was passed. And now we were on to the stage of implementation. In those last 72 hours, the war is over. And Israel, in those last 72 hours, drops 4 million. That's 4,000,000, 4 million cluster submunitions on South Lebanon. You read the reports. There was one report by Human Rights Watch. It's called Flooding South Lebanon. And it was like out of a science fiction film. Entire villages saturated with the cluster bomblets. Roofs saturated with it. Some of the cluster bomblets were fired into homes, the ceilings, the floors, the furniture covered with them. You're young, you're Jewish, you're idealistic. You don't want to defend that in public. 2008, 2009, Israel invades Gaza. It drops white phosphorus, a substance which reaches 800 degrees centigrade, 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. 800 degrees centigrade. It drops the white phosphorus on Al-Quds Hospital. It drops the white phosphorus on Al-Wafa Hospital. It drops the white phosphorus on a school, a humanitarian warehouse, a marketplace. Human Rights Watch put out a report that was called Rain of Fire, describing what happened with the white phosphorus. You're young, you're Jewish, you're idealistic. You don't want to defend that. Now, there are people who will defend it. If you're Rush Limbaugh's son, Sarah Palin's daughter, Rick Santorum's I don't know what, but whatever, some offspring of that freak. Yeah, they'll be careful because he may be the president of your country right below. They'll defend it. It's true. Some people, they'll even defend breaking the kneecaps of nuns. But it's just not a Jewish thing. Jews don't do that. At least they don't publicly do that. They do not. And so it's become nearly impossible for Jews to carry on, to defend the way Israel carries on. And that's all a long way or a short way of saying there's now a public out there, a broad public, an international public, a public, incidentally, some of you will be surprised to learn, a public which includes Canada. If you look at the BBC polls, you know, the polls which judge positive influence in the world, negative influence on the world, you would be very surprised by what the Canadian public says. About 15% will say Israel has a positive impact on the world. About 60% of the Canadian public says negative. It's completely out of kilter with your government. The public has changed. They're ready to listen. And that, to me, is the first and most important development in terms of trying to resolve the conflict. People are ready to hear you. But now, there's a challenge. The challenge is a public patience is not limitless, and the public can be fickle. If you want to reach the public, you have to present a message that's uniform, unified, and persuasive to them. If you don't present a uniform, unified, persuasive message, you will lose the public. If this gentleman here, he says, the solution to the conflict, it's obvious. One state, there has to be one state between Israel and Palestine. But the gentleman next to him says, no, he's wrong. There should be two states. And the third gentleman says, no, they're both wrong. There should be a binational state. But the fourth person says, no, they're all wrong. There should be a federal state. And the fifth woman, she says, no, they all got it wrong. It should be an Islamic state. When the public hears this cacophony of messages, what does cacophony mean? It's sort of dissonant noises. When he hears these dissonant noises, one state, two states, binational state, federal state, Islamic state, the public says, look, they don't even know what they want. Forget it. Let's move on to something else. You lose them. So you have to present a message that will not lose a public at a historic opportunity when they're now ready to listen. But then the obvious question is, what is the message that you're going to present? Because I said it not only has to be unified and uniform, I also said it has to be persuasive. You have to convince the public that the message you're presenting on how to solve the conflict is just and it's reasonable. Because I think that's what most people are looking for. Something that sounds fair and something that sounds reasonable. And the question is, what is that solution? I myself have to say, I was perplexed a long time on this particular question. And so I decided I was going to go back to the source to see what he had to say. Namely, a couple of summers ago, I took some time off and decided I wanted to see what Mr. Gandhi, the Mahatma, had to say on the subject. Because I thought he would provide some useful insight, some shrewd insight on this particular question. For three reasons. Number one, Mr. Gandhi was confronted with the same sort of challenge as the Palestinians. He wanted to end an occupation. In his day, the British occupation of India. Number two, Gandhi was facing the most formidable power the world had seen to that day, namely the British Empire. And the Palestinians, they're facing a formidable regional power, namely Israel, but behind it, they're facing, of course, the most formidable power since the British Empire, namely the United States. And number three, I won't try to argue it, I'll simply assert it, namely, I don't think the Palestinians have a military option, and therefore, whatever they achieve, it will have to be achieved through the same sorts of methods that Gandhi championed, namely some form of nonviolent disobedience and nonviolent civil resistance. So, with those three considerations in mind, I sat down and I started to read the Mahatma. It's not a small task. His collected works come to 98 volumes, 500 pages per volume. He had a lot to say about everything. And on most of the subjects on which he spoke, he freely admitted he didn't have a clue what he was talking about. But that never stopped the Mahatma from venturing an opinion. He wasn't always as humble as you might have wished. And the truth be told, most of Gandhi's writings had very little to do with politics in a narrow sense. Gandhi's major preoccupations were diet and good health. He was obsessed with good diet and good health. You could call him a premature Oprah. If you read his prison letters, his letters consist of August 1st, I weigh 90.5 pounds. August 2nd, I weigh 90.2 pounds. August 3rd, I weigh 90.7 pounds. Sort of like Oprah, but a different order of magnitude, obviously. And of course, he had all sorts of cures for every possible malady. He had a cure for indigestion. He had a cure for constipation. He had a cure for impotence. He had a cure for a home cure, not pills. No, he had something usually having to do with goat's milk or cow dung or something. Just mix them up, and you'll be fine or you'll be dead, whatever. But, of course, Gandhi also had a lot to say about politics. And one of his most important insights, I think, was Gandhi said politics is not about trying to change public opinion. Politics is about trying to get people to act on what they already know is wrong. Now, for me, that was a kind of revelation, because I was part of a political tradition where I believed that me and my friends, or we used to call each other comrades, that we knew the truth. And our truth was scientific. And that our job was to go among the benighted masses, the masses who had been fooled and duped and tricked by the capitalist system, and to enlighten them. But Gandhi said, no, that's not what politics is about. Politics is about trying to get people to act on what they already know is wrong. The problem, he said, is not that people are ignorant. The problem is that people are lazy. That's the challenge. And everybody in this room understands that experience, because everybody in this room has, he or she, had the experience. You get up in the morning, and from the moment you step out of your apartment or your home, you look around you and you say, that's wrong. That's unfair. That's unjust. That shouldn't be. That shouldn't be happening. You vent your indignation. You express your disgust and anger. But if you're like myself, you don't do anything about it. And Gandhi said the purpose of nonviolent civil disobedience, the purpose of getting yourself arrested, the purpose of engaging in sit-ins and activities of that sort, it's to stimulate the conscience of people. To use his words, it's to quicken the conscience of the public to get them to act. That's what politics is about. To galvanize the public through your example of self-sacrifice. So what does it mean practically? I can give you an example from my own life. I'm always railing and indignant against the capitalist system. It's unfair a small handful of people control so much of the wealth, whereas the masses of people, they work so hard and they can barely make ends meet. It's wrong. And you can hear me pontificate about it for hours on end. But I don't do anything about it. And then this past year in my city, New York, I start hearing about this group of people who are talking about the 1%, the 99%, and they're camping in Wall Street. I thought, really? But I didn't really do anything about it. I just heard whispers and rumors. Then one day, I hear 800 of them get arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge. And I live in Brooklyn. And now I begin to think, I say, hey, wait a minute here. You're always talking a good talk. You're always saying how rotten the system is. And now these people are willing to get arrested. What about you? What are you going to do? Just talk? Or are you going to act? And in fact, exactly as Gandhi would have hoped, the fact that these 800 people got arrested did galvanize large numbers of New Yorkers to stop just talking and to start acting. Nobody needed to tell me the system was wrong and unfair. The challenge was to get me to act on what I already knew to be wrong. But there is one caution or qualification. And the qualification is, no matter how just your methods, no matter how moral your methods, if the public doesn't agree with your goal, they will not be responsive to your methods. It's not just a question of means, meaning nonviolent methods. It's also a question of ends. What's your goal? Now, I know some of you are thinking, means, ends, this sounds like Philo 102, I'm out of here. No, it's not really complicated. Everybody in this room knows, as a practical example, what I have in mind. So if you take, for example, in the United States, the question of abortion, Americans are, if you look at public opinion polls, they are divided right down the middle on the question of abortion. 50% of Americans call themselves pro-choice, 50% of Americans call themselves pro-life. And now if you do a simple thought experiment, imagine if the 50% of Americans who call themselves pro-life decided that en masse they're going to descend on all the abortion clinics in the United States, and they make a commitment. We are going to fast unto the death, a Gandhian tactic, until and unless these physicians stop performing abortions. Nobody can disagree with their methods. What could be more moral than a willingness to inflict no bodily harm on anyone except yourself, and a willingness to give up your life? But if you ask most pro-choice people, would that fast unto the death, will it persuade you of the wrongness of abortion? Most pro-choice people, they'll say, I hope they do fast until the death. I hope they all drop dead. Unless there's an agreement on the goal, the method is not going to work. And more importantly, or as importantly, if you choose the wrong goal, instead of building a movement, you end up creating a cult. And a cult is very different than a movement. You take the example of Mr. Gandhi. Most people in the room know Mr. Gandhi as the leader of a leader of the Indian independence movement. But Gandhi had a second life, which he lived simultaneously with that first life. The second life is Gandhi was an ashram leader. An ashram was like a cult. And he was the head of the ashram. He had several ashrams. And he was like the guru. And Gandhi was a very, very tough guru. You want to be in my ashram? No meat, because we are vegetarians. No sex, even if you're married, because we are brahmacharis. No idle jokes, no reading in the toilet, no wristwatches, no underwear. He was very tough. But Gandhi, of course, understood there's a very big difference between a cult and a political movement. If you set those standards, no meat, no sex, no jokes, no underwear, for the Indian independence movement, then the entire movement could fit in this room. You have to adjust your goals to what the public is ready for. Otherwise, you end up not building a movement, but creating a cult. And from that, I would say we can infer or deduce two critical conclusions for what we're going to get to next, namely how to solve it. The first conclusion is, as always happens when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, when I was picked up by two very nice young gentlemen today at the train station, one before the blink of an eye, one said, "I'm for one state," the other said, "I'm for two states." It began already. And of course the question is, are you for one state or for two states? And I said then, as I will say now, I think those sorts of questions are completely irrelevant. Because politics is not about what you support, what he supports, what she supports, or what I support. That's not politics. Politics is what the public is ready to support. Where is the public? What is possible to reach the public with? What message can reach them? And what message will lose them? Are we building a movement, or are we creating a cult? The second critical conclusion is politics is not about your personal morality or my personal morality. That is not politics. Politics is the public sense of right and wrong. What will keep them, what will lose them. So, let us say this first row of people, raise your hand if you can. The first row, just raise your hand. Thank you. So you have this row of people, and they happen to live in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. And they decide they are going to blockade the boulevard on which I live, Ocean Parkway, they're going to try to get the public to act. And they publish a manifesto, a statement. They say, people of Brooklyn, it's winter. The temperatures are frigid. And because rents are so high, people are so desperate, in particular the migrant laborers from Mexico who come here and do work which no New Yorker wants to do for wages that no New Yorker will accept in order to send back half of the paycheck to their family back home. They end up, as is the case, they're in the street, freezing in the winter. And these people in the first row, they say, you know, New Yorkers, every one of you has a winter coat in your closet which you never use. In fact, you all have 2 winter coats in your closet that you never use. Most of you have 3 that you never use. Give those coats to the homeless in the streets. Personally, I think that message would resonate for most New Yorkers. And they wouldn't even begrudge the fact that people stop the traffic. You know, they say, you know, those guys, they have a point. I really never use that coat. I have a spare coat. I never use it. Why don't I give it to the homeless? Knowing me, I have a whole army of winter coats, enough for the whole, Royal Canadian Mounted Police in my closet. I would go marching out with 3 of them and feeling very proud of myself doing so. But let's take a hypothetical, a second hypothetical. Let's say the same row of people, they went out in the street, they issued the same manifesto, except for one change. People of New York, it's freezing outside. There are all these homeless people, and so on. But then at the end they say, all of you have a spare room in your apartment. So give the homeless people not your spare coat, but give them your spare room. Now, I notice here, and a kind of respect that I have to say, nobody is laughing. Sometimes in other audiences they laugh. I think everyone understands there is a moral argument there. And personally, I've wrestled with it a lot. And I have to acknowledge, I think those demonstrators, they have the better moral argument. If we use the classic standard, what would Jesus do? I think Jesus would give the spare room. However, I have to also say, I'm not ready to do it. I know they have the better moral argument. I'm going to admit it. But I'm not ready to do it. I'm not. Which is to say, if they made that argument, I think most New Yorkers would say, no, those folks are nuts. They ought to get locked up. You lose the public. The public is not ready to go there. If you overreach the public with your demands, instead of building a movement, you end up creating a cult. And so now, the obvious question is, what demands or what constituents of a solution can reach a public and what will overreach it? And here I think the answer is utterly, though many people strongly disagree with me, the answer is utterly uncontroversial. Because if you look at every institution which is representative of public opinion, or the most respected legal and human rights organizations, the same answer comes back. And the answer is the only solution that has broad public support, the only solution is two states, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, on the June 1967 border, and what's called a just resolution of the Palestinian refugee question based on the right of return and compensation. Anything that goes beyond that, I am not going to argue the morality of it, because I don't think the morality is relevant. Anything that goes beyond that, I say, loses the public. If you take the most representative political body in the world today, what's the most representative political body? United Nations General Assembly. Every year the UN has a resolution entitled Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine Question. Every year they put forth that same formula or the same terms for resolving the conflict. Two states, June 67 border, just resolution of the refugee question based on the right of return and compensation. Every year the vote's the same. The whole world on one side, Israel, the United States, and some South Sea islands on the other side. That's not hyperbole. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's the record. 1997, the vote, 155-2. The whole world on one side, Israel and the United States on the other side. 2004, the vote, 161-7. The whole world on one side, Israel, the US, Australia, Grenada, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau on the other side. 2010, the vote, 165-7. The whole world on one side, Israel, the United States, Australia, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, and Palau on the other side. This past year, the vote was 166-6. Every year. Actually, as a small footnote, it's even more exaggerated than it appears on paper, because Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau are American protectorates. We own them. They belong to what's called the Compact of Free Association. It literally is the whole world versus the US and Israel. Now, some of you in this room are no doubt thinking, well, that's because they're all anti-Semitic. And okay, for argument's sake, let's assume that the whole world, if not galaxy, is anti-Semitic, with the exception of Nauru, Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. So let's accept that as a hypothesis, and then let's move to the most respected legal body or legal institution in the world today? Who would like to venture the name of that institution? You can just call it out. Or as your generation says, shout out. Anyone?
UN.
Legal body. Yeah, The Hague, the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And as it happens, in 2004, the International Court of Justice, it rendered what it called an advisory opinion on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And it expressed in its opinion, legal opinion, on several of the crucial issues bearing on the conflict. The conflict has what's called, in the lingo of the peace process, it has what are called the final status or permanent status issues. Who can name, yesterday there was a young man who named 3 of 4 in the University of Toronto and Scarborough. Who can name the 4 final status issues? Raise your hand. You can consult with your neighbor and make a because I still believe in communism, a collective response. Anyone? Okay, you can consult with everybody you know. You can Twitter, Facebook, and everything, but you get 15 more seconds. Okay, somebody raise his or her hand. At this point, I'll accept the collective response from the whole audience because yes.
The right to return?
Okay, refugees. Settlements.
Water.
Not any longer. Water used to be. Refugees, settlements.
Old city of
Jerusalem, and borders. Okay. So in Toronto, it required 1 person. Here, it required 400. I won't infer anything from that. In any case, yes, borders, Jerusalem, settlements, and refugees. And it happened the International Court of Justice, the highest judicial body in the world, it did render an opinion on most of those questions. Number 1, it said under international law, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. That's a fundamental principle of law. Israel acquired the West Bank and Gaza in the course of the June 1967 war. Therefore, Israel has no title to any of the West Bank and no title to any of Gaza. Those are, in the words of the International Court of Justice, and I'm quoting their terminology, those are occupied Palestinian territories. Number 2, the International Court of Justice said, Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention prohibits the transfer by an occupying power of its population to occupied territories. Therefore, all the settlements are illegal under international law. And all 500,000 settlers are illegally in occupied Palestinian territory. And number 3, the International Court of Justice said, Israel occupied East Jerusalem in the course of a war, the June 1967 war. Israel has no title to East Jerusalem. It is occupied Palestinian territory. As it happened, because of the nature of the case the court was dealing with, it didn't render an opinion on the refugee question, but the major human rights organizations have rendered an authoritative opinion. So if I were to ask you to name the 2 major human rights organizations in the world today, you would say?
Amnesty International.
Amnesty International and?
Human Rights
Exactly,
Watch.
Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And both Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, they both said, and now I'm quoting them, Human Rights Watch said, we urge Israel to recognize the right to return for those Palestinians and their descendants who fled from territory that is now within the state of Israel and who have maintained appropriate links with that territory. Amnesty International said, we call for Palestinians who fled or were expelled from Israel, the West Bank, or Gaza, along with those of their descendants who have maintained genuine links with the area, to be able to exercise their right of return. Now, bear in mind that on the questions where the International Court of Justice rendered its opinion, borders, settlements, and East Jerusalem, it wasn't a minority of judges. It was not a plurality of judges. It was not a majority of judges. It was every single judge on that court, including two who are of Jewish descent, Rosalind Higgins, she married an Irishman, and Thomas Bergenthal, who happens to be a real Holocaust survivor, including the two Jewish judges. Every single one of the 15 judges agreed on those points. There was no dissent, none, on those issues. And the major human rights organizations agree on the question of the Palestinian right of return. Now, three conclusions follow, in my opinion, from the record as I've just recited it. Number one, there is nothing whatsoever controversial about how to resolve the conflict. There is no dispute in the world whatsoever on the terms for resolving the conflict. Whenever you